We'll get started. Good evening and welcome to this evening's Etche Speaker Series and UIS Black History Month event, Black Lives Matter Through the Prism of Frederick Douglass. During tonight's discussion, we will highlight two important Etche themes: recognizing our social responsibility towards our larger communities and developing an awareness of and respect for the diversity of cultures and peoples in this country and the world. These themes were as central to Frederick Douglass's writings and speeches as they are to the Black Lives Matter movement today. When we say Black Lives Matter, we are not only referring to police brutality and mass incarceration, but the systemic omission of important historical figures from our educational curricula. How many people here learned about Frederick Douglass during elementary or high school? Raise your hand if you remember. Okay, good. My intention is not to blame any individual in the audience who may not have learned that, but to give just one example of how our system is biased against the lives of African Americans. Therefore, it is our social responsibility to inform and educate ourselves in order to correct these omissions and recognize that the historical contributions of our black brothers and sisters are just as important as those of whites. So, for those of us... Is that me? I'm not touching anything. It's coming from somewhere else. Is there another?
These two might show.
Yeah. Okay. Wait. So in order to put this event into context, I thought I would give a brief biography of Frederick Douglass. Frederick Augustus Washington Bailey was born into slavery around the year 1818. His mother, a black slave, was an irregular presence in his life before she died when he was around 10. He never had a relationship with his father, a white plantation owner. He was raised initially by his maternal grandmother, but was sent to Baltimore to work as a servant when he was 12. While a teenager in Baltimore, Douglass began to learn to read and write. Initially, his master's wife, Sophia Ald, taught him, but later, under pressure from her husband, she stopped. After that, he secretly continued to teach himself, a process which he later credited with defining his views on freedom and human rights. Douglass fought for many years for his freedom and finally got it in 1838, when he was about 20 years old. At this time, he married Anne Murray, a free black woman, and the couple took the name Douglass to avoid detection by his previous owners. He became a licensed preacher in 1839 and came to be known for his eloquent writings and speeches against the institution of slavery. He published his first autobiography in 1845 and traveled to Ireland and England the same year, where he toured for 2 years and spoke to crowded halls against slavery. After returning to the United States in 1847, Douglass continued to gain fame as a human rights advocate. By the time of the Civil War, he was one of the most famous black men in the country, known for his eloquent speeches against slavery and for women's rights. After the Civil War, Douglass received several political appointments. He was sent by President Grant to the West Indies as part of a commission to investigate the possibility of annexing Santo Domingo to serve as a state for African Americans. In 1872, he became the first African American to be nominated for vice president. In 1874, he was appointed as United States Marshal for the District of Columbia. And in 1888, at the Republican National Convention, he became the first African American to receive a vote for president by a major political party. Douglass continued to publish newspapers and books, as well as to speak publicly both in the U.S. and internationally, until his death at 77. He died of natural causes in 1895, and thousands of people passed by his coffin to show their respect at the Metropolitan African Methodist Episcopal Church in Washington, D.C. He is buried in the Mount Hope Cemetery in Rochester, New York. Now, Dr. Ty Dooley will introduce or give some background on the event.
Thank you, Sophia. So first, I want to go ahead and thank UIS for providing the venue for this. I want to thank the Etche Speaker Series for providing the venue for this event. I want to go ahead and thank our panelists, Jerry Doss, Dooley, Tiffani Saunders, and Dorine for participating respectively. We're well represented both from public health, from the public administration program, from legal studies, from the community, and from the diversity center. So I want to thank you all for coming out as well. This is really an interesting topic, and it's timely, and we're well overdue for actually having a discussion here at UIS. I guess to sort of open this up to give a little bit of context, and Sophia did a great job. In 1857, some things were happening in America. We were engaged in 3 different wars. There was the Mormon War out in Utah. There was a Seminole War down in Florida. And then there was a Kansas conflict in terms of whether or not Kansas would be admitted as either a slave or a free state. From the perspective of liberty, only white males above the age of 21 who owned property could actually vote. So that would actually eliminate most of you from actually engaging in voting. And even then, you could not actually vote for your senator. The senators were actually elected by state legislators. So I wanted to give a little bit of context in terms of what was going on, in Frederick Douglass's mind during this time frame. When we think about this notion of justice, there wasn't a whole lot of justice for very many Americans in the United States at that time. Now, in appeal to your better angels and in the context of a conversation on race and culture, today's panel discussion is really recognition of the plight that at-risk populations face in general and African Americans in particular. Now, in the context of this conversation on race and culture in America, to say that all lives matter does not address the issue at hand, and it tends to minimize, and it does nothing to address the frustration, the anger, and despair experienced by so many African American communities across this country today. One of the tenets of the ETI speaker series is the recognition of the social responsibility of the individual within their larger community and an awareness and respect for the diversity of others. I can think of few things that are more important than the applications of these tenets by those that we entrust to safeguard our communities. And by that, I'm talking about the police. I'm talking about law enforcement. We are all part of a great society, this American experiment. We are all in this together. And for those that think that this doesn't really apply to them, that this is an African American male problem, maybe it is now, but I would say to you that you're next. What we really are speaking about today are issues of justice. That we live in a rational legal society, and the notion that the United States is a society which contains equal parts liberty and equal parts justice. You may not know this, but in the Constitution, in the preamble, the concept of justice was the first principle detailed. We, the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union, establish justice to ensure domestic tranquility, and you probably have heard the rest. In a just society, the equal application of the law is fundamental. There should not be a distinction of results relative to our interaction with police. Whether you are white, black, immigrant or citizen, Muslim or Christian, male or female, the interaction should be the same. The police must adhere to the laws that they are sworn to protect, or we must hold them accountable. What we are also speaking about today, and while we have this up to date, the first part of this is about the notion of and we'll talk about this a little bit more, the nature of morality. And so when we think about this notion of morality and the constant vigilance that surrounds morality and having a moral criminal justice system, not just one that's legally accountable or ethically accountable, but morally accountable. As a Christian, as a citizen, as an African American, this concept of morality serves as an aspirational compass for me and for how I interpret these issues of justice. For those who would scoff at this notion of morality, I'd like to paraphrase Tolstoy, arguably one of the greatest Russian writers. You're on a planet right now that rotates 1,000 miles an hour. You travel 24,000 miles more or less over the course of a day. yet you don't feel it. So when we ponder the notion of morality and the existence of God, just because you don't see him doesn't mean that he's not there. It is my hope that our discussion tonight will make you uncomfortable, maybe inspire you a little, but most importantly, motivate you to be an engaged and a moral citizen. And I look forward to our conversation.
Okay, I'm just going to introduce our speakers this evening. Panelists. Dr. Dorine Brand, on that end, is an assistant professor in the Department of Public Health at UIS. Her primary research interests include exploring mechanisms that help reduce health disparities among racial groups. Pastor Jerry Doss is the lead pastor of Abundant Faith Christian Center in Springfield, Illinois. An established voice within the community, serving on several boards, including the American Cancer Society, United Way, Prison Fellowship, and Springfield Urban League. Dr. Ty Dooley, director of the MPA program at UIS. He holds a PhD in public policy from the University of Arkansas, and his research interests include public policy, education, and community development. Tess Dooley is a visiting instructor of legal studies in the College of Public Affairs and Administration. Her research interests include U.S. health policy, ERISA, and the impact of the Affordable Care Act on business. Tiffani Saunders is an instructor of sociology and African American studies. Her research interests include sociology of family, mental health issues, and illness, law, courts, and teaching and learning. Okay, now I think each one of the panelists will give a short presentation, and we will start with Pastor Doss.
First of all, it's good to be here. It's good to see you all. Thank you. Thank you for the invitation. And I must say I was looking forward to coming and having a conversation, some dialogue about Black Lives Matter. My background is from the South, born in Covington, Tennessee, and I'll probably reference my dad on several occasions. His birthday was yesterday, and he's 81 years old. And one reason is because he grew up in the South and during a time of, I guess you would say, Jim Crow law. So therefore, I learned a lot there. He worked on a plantation, so it'll come from that perspective. I am been pastoring for about 23 years, but that's a small part of what I do. I'm a developer in the community and looking forward to making things better for so many people. So thank you for this invitation.
Dr. Dooley.
Well, just briefly, I just really want to again, been at UIS for the last almost 3 years, it'll be 3 years in July. We moved here from Texas, lived in Arkansas for several years, and so we're originally from Arkansas. So the only sort of thing that I want to say is that you really, at this point, is that the total bent of our society, of America, does bend toward justice, but it bends toward justice not by itself. It bends toward justice through action, through people, through constant vigilance. And it's important, I think, about football games at this point. When you think about a football game, sometimes a ref makes a bad call, right? And it's hard to go ahead and make sure that you get good referees. And so I think about law enforcement in that same way, that law enforcement, sometimes they make a bad call, but it's very difficult then in order to go ahead and get law enforcement to do what needs to be done from that standpoint. And there are ways of doing it, but it's difficult the way our system is set up. But it's possible, but it requires an active and engaged polity. It requires you to be involved. It requires you to go ahead and stand up, because it may be someone else's problem right now, but eventually it will be yours.
So I'm going to talk a little bit about the legal implications of Black Lives Matter movement. So the Black Lives Matter movement is intrinsically tied to the criminal justice system. It is unlikely that we would see the Black Lives Matter movement if it weren't for the disparities in the American criminal justice system for Black Americans. The 23 Ways to Die video that many of you saw that was playing before we got started, it highlights some of the Black Americans who died at the hands of police officers here in the United States. I'll say some of their names: Amadou Diallo, Sean Bell, Walter Scott, Sandra Bland, Alton Sterling, Philando Castile, Tamir Rice, Eric Garner, Freddie Gray. Those names represent just a handful of the lives that have been taken at the hands of police officers since 1999, when Diallo, an unarmed Black man, was gunned down in a New York City doorway when police officers erroneously thought he was holding a gun. More recently, we saw the death of Michael Brown, who was shot by a police officer in Ferguson, Missouri, in 2014. This resulted in nationwide protests. What civil rights advocates say is law enforcement's tendency to be overly aggressive when dealing with Black men. Black Lives Matter movement evolved from a social media hashtag. Just many people like you, just on using their computers, using social media, started a hashtag, were outraged by what they were seeing, using the Black Lives Matter slogan. This turned into a national protest against police brutality. Some will argue, well, there's more whites that are killed by police, so what's the problem? Well, when we think about it and we adjust for population, we see that despite the higher total number of whites who are killed by police, Black people are more likely here in the United States to be killed at the hands of law enforcement. Young Black men specifically are 9 times more likely to be killed by police officers than other races in the same age demographic. We look at overall in 2015, Black people were killed at twice the rate of white people, Hispanics, and Native Americans. So this is definitely an issue that has led to the Black Lives Matter movement. We have seen a trend since the movement has begun with the numbers lowering in 2016, but there is still cause for alarm. There are things happening today that can turn the hands back. We could see these numbers start to rise again. Our current president has said that he is in favor of the stop and frisk policies. And what many of you may not know is that the stop and frisk policies has been administered in an unconstitutional way that adversely impacts African American and Hispanic men. And so, and we've seen the confirmation of Senator Jeff Sessions as Attorney General. And I could go on and on about why that is troubling and why we may see, again, not the same rigor of going after law enforcement to hold them accountable for the disparate impact in African American communities and on African American men. We see disparities in the criminal justice system that go well beyond the police force. It's not just a law enforcement problem. This is truly a systemic criminal justice problem. Blacks are more likely to encounter police brutality, but they're also more likely to be criminalized. And what I mean by criminalized is once you are approached by police and you're arrested, you're more likely to be convicted of something, you're more likely to do time, then you're in the system. And so we can look at the prison population and we can see that in 2016, blacks made up 13.3% of the U.S. population, yet blacks made up 37.8% of the federal population here in the United States. So again, that disparate impact that we're seeing, disparate treatment by the system. I can go on and on with different examples, and I'm sure we'll have questions and I can talk more about that. But I wanted to kind of end my statements by just saying that whatever problems may exist in the African American community, and people will point to different problems within the community that may be a cause of this. Maybe it's not an outside problem, maybe it's an internal problem. Whatever problems may exist, there is no justification for our black sons to live in a police state in fear for their lives when walking, standing, sitting, driving, running, or doing absolutely nothing at all. Black lives are no more expendable than other lives. To quote Frederick Douglass, power concedes nothing without a demand. The Black Lives Matter movement is an uprising, a demand on the American criminal justice system, an alarm sounding as notice that black Americans will no longer submit to injustice.
Hi. So I'm going to talk a little bit from thinking about this from a bit of a historical perspective. I had the fortune of teaching a freshman seminar on the American Dream for the first time last fall. And when I was planning that class, one of the things that I wanted to make sure that I did was to explore the American Dream today by looking at where the American Dream came from sort of historically. So we might identify the start of the American Dream with the term's introduction into the hearts and minds of American citizens in the 1920s. But I think the American Dream actually started with the American Revolution and the Declaration of Independence. So if we start there, we realize quickly that the ideas associated with the creation of this nation were built on a foundation where all lives were not seen as equal. If we start there, we realize that our forefathers were fighting for freedom from England and ultimately declared their freedom while simultaneously holding slaves. So the tenet, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men were created equal and that they are endowed by their creator with certain and unalienable rights, including life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, really means that white men had these unalienable rights. That is certainly self-evident when black bodies were subject to enslavement and ultimately denied those rights at the time the document was written. If we start with the Declaration of Independence, we realize the very foundation of our country was built on the notion that some lives matter more than others, that some lives can be and should be exploited, that some bodies do not belong to their owners or the person carrying them, that some lives and bodies can be used for profit, that humanness can be stripped from some bodies. That is the foundation on which this country is built. The passing of time does not change this foundation. The foundation, since its inception, has not been solid, however. It is not made from concrete. It's built on sand. As a result, it's subject to erosion. It can be blown away in the wind. It can be washed away with rain. It becomes degraded due to the marching feet, dripping sweat, salty tears, shed blood of those who oppose having their bodies viewed in this way. The foundation remains in one way or another. It remains because sand can be refilled and transformed. Add a little water, you have the ability to build a sand castle. We've witnessed a transformation in the form of these ideas over time, a change in how these ideas are enacted over time. So the devaluing of black bodies does not take the form of slavery today, and the hashtag Black Lives Matter simply draws attention to inequities built into the foundation of this country, a foundation that was laid in its infancy. So in his West Indian emancipation speech, Frederick Douglass outlined several ideas that are useful for understanding the role of the Black Lives Matter movement. First, he notes that the impact or effect of bondage that becomes ingrained in a people will last for generations. That the physical act of freedom does not completely free the body physically or mentally. Likewise, the physical act of freedom doesn't free the nation from ideas on which its foundation is built. In the scheme of things, freedom has never really been achieved. Once physical bondage was outlawed, former slaves experienced mental bondage during the segregation era. During this time, black bodies belonged to their owners, I guess, but they weren't equal to those of whites. They were not allowed to convene with one another in public spaces, or marry one another, or look each other in the eye, or be addressed with respect. It remains self-evident that free blacks were less than free and certainly did not have the same unalienable rights afforded to other free persons. Black lives and bodies remain subject to extermination through lynching, burning, beating. Today, these same bodies are subject to extermination by inconsistent enforcement of laws. Second, Douglass notes that gatherings like those meant to commemorate the emancipation of the West Indies from England provide an opportunity for nations to reflect on their commitment to freedom and inequality. In much the same way, the Black Lives Matter movement and hashtag should provide us with the same opportunity to look at the unequal application of principles like freedom and equality. Instead of turning the mirrors on ourselves or our nation, we have elected to examine the bodies or the lives the movement is trying to highlight. In other words, we once again turn our gaze away from the oppressor and towards the oppressed, a sentiment Douglass also expresses. Finally, Douglass writes that women provided, quote, the highest services rendered the anti-slavery cause. In other words, women played a major role in the anti-slavery movement. Women have played a role in nearly every major social change. Black Lives Matter is especially important in this regard. Its inception by a group of women highlights the role of women in the cause of equality and situates women in the center rather than in supporting roles. Ultimately, Black Lives Matter and its proficient use of social media documents a part of the American experience present since this country's inception, a foundation that will take a long time to destroy because it's so ingrained in nearly every aspect of our existence.
Good evening, everyone. How's everybody doing today? Great. Let's liven up a little bit. How's everybody doing today? Great. So glad to hear. As mentioned earlier, I'm Dorine Brand, Dr. Dorine Brand, and I'll be coming from a perspective of health. As Pastor Dawson on the end there works in the community, he's a pastor. I come from a perspective of doing a lot of community outreach, community engagement, working with communities to facilitate research, and specifically working with faith-based organizations, so churches, to promote health. I specifically work with African American churches to promote health. Was all heard of the Faith Fitness program? Has anybody heard of that? No. Okay. Oh, one. Okay, great. One person. All right. All right. I established the Faith Fitness program when I came here in 2012 to work with faith-based organizations. My work revolves around looking at the historical perspectives of health in general. As we know, what is the number one highest cause of death, of disease among everybody in America? Heart disease, yes, heart disease. Great. So cardiovascular disease can encompass many types of diseases such as, go ahead. High cholesterol, what else? Hypertension, what else? Diabetes risk factor, what else? Too much plaque, okay, and yes, in the arteries, right, they can cause coronary heart disease. So these are a lot of type of heart diseases that encompasses cardiovascular disease. So my main work focuses on cardiovascular disease. So we know that cardiovascular disease is a main killer for all Americans totally. However, within that segment of the population, African Americans have the highest rates of heart disease. Almost half of African American adults have some form of heart disease. About 47.1% have heart disease. So that is astounding. It's an epidemic. It's a major situation that needs to be addressed. Well, let's see. If that is a main issue within this population, and we have African Americans that have the highest among all groups, racial groups, what's the issue? What is the problem? So it calls you to think and to look at questions of how to address this issue. Now, I grew up in Chicago, so I grew up in the urban areas. Anybody from Chicago? Yay, Chicago. All right. I grew up in Chicago, so I grew up in the public system, the public school system. Anybody from a public school in Chicago? Great, public school system. And I matriculated through the school system, and while attending school, many times we had screenings that were done. We had ear screenings, eye screenings that were facilitated within schools. Though if your parents had health insurance, you can also get that on the outside, but those type of screenings were done back then to test if someone is in soundness in their body while attending school. And one major thing that was a mandate for everyone to have were something that you need before entering to college. Immunizations, yes, immunizations. Something that is a necessity for everyone, because if one person has measles, they come to school, who else is going to have that? The other classmate, right. Many times we think about herd immunity, which is a concept of if everyone or the majority of people have some type of immunization against a disease, then the rest of the individual will not get that disease. That holds true in a lot of cases, but there are some outliers where that may not hold true. And so in that case, everyone is required to get immunizations. So growing up in Chicago, I worked within the Chicago Department of Public Health, looking at infant mortality and other ways of how to extend life. And I also grew up in the church, still a part of the church now, but I grew up in the church. And who's all attended church before? Okay, the majority of people are here. In church, we have testimonies, right? And we testify about what's happening in your life. Many times within the African-American community, within the African-American church, you hear testimonies about people's heart disease or surgeries or their son being taken to jail or some type of issue that may arise in that person's life, and they share it among their people, among their population, because it's a social support system, a social support network. And the church is a central part of comfort. Okay, it's an institution that has been a multifaceted institution to be able to deliver health programming effectively, to deliver education effectively, after school programs. There's one program that's called the Safe Haven program that's now in existence in Chicago, where the Chicago Public School System partner with faith-based organizations to provide a safe haven for children who are in grammar school, elementary school, so it can alleviate or help them to maneuver through the violent streets or through violent activities. So give them another option, a healthy option. The church, again, does this. So looking at it from that perspective, I grew up in the church, as I mentioned, and I would hear all these testimonies about people, having heart disease, or they say, well, the doctor said the cholesterol got me, but I don't got it. Okay, well, your test says you have it. And so we're looking at how people would matriculate and how people would analyze what they have as opposed to what could have been or what could be. People have faith, and it's a beautiful thing about people's spirit, because some people's spirit will keep them alive on their deathbed until someone arrives there, until they say their piece to that last person, and after they see that person, they go on and pass on. Have you ever seen that before or heard of it before? A person's spirit can arise and allow that to happen. And meantime, it's connected within the African American church, which is the Christian church, mainly the Protestant church, which is the historical denominations, mainly within the African American community. We have the main thing where many faith principles or faith tenets of the African American church is founded on the scriptures of the Holy Bible. And so looking at this perspective in this community, researchers look at how can we partner with a mainstay within the African American community to help improve the health of the African American population. We know that there are many different issues such as access to care. There's a lack of access to care. Well, many African Americans are less likely to go to the traditional health care institution or access the traditional healthcare system to get health care. Why is that? Well, let's see. Let's think of things historically. Well, there has been many injustices that have been done previously. Who has heard of the Tuskegee syphilis study? This is an experiment that was funded by the federal government, the U.S. Public Health Service, the federal government, as some people would say, the government that allowed the experimentation of African American men in Alabama County, Macon County in Alabama, allowed the persistence of syphilis to study the long-term effects on the human body without allowing treatment to be administered when treatment was available. Initially, when the study started, treatment was not available, it was not discovered, but in the process of the study, treatment was discovered. Penicillin was the one that was the antidote to syphilis. However, it was intentionally withheld to allow to see the long-term effects. So historical events such as that cause a mistrust within the African American population. And because of the mistrust, there is a lack of participation in research. There's a lack of usage or utilization in the traditional healthcare system. And also, there is a sense of timidness or a sense of hesitation when the word research is brought up. Therefore, it's important to be able to diversify the landscape of researchers or of public health, that so other people that's in the same population, African American, can see people that mirror them. Because many times people trust what they know, the customs that they're used to, or the cultures that they're used to. And so in the same regard, African Americans do the same thing. So my research stems from that avenue because in the end, we all impact one another.
Dr. Bryn?
Yes.
Can we wrap it up?
Okay, sure.
Yeah.
Okay, great. We all impact one another. So if I'm sick with measles, you may be sick with measles. But if we can all work together to address the major issues of health, we all can be a healthier nation. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so we're going to start with a few questions here, and then we're going to open it up to questions from the audience. Okay. Pastor Doss, Americans are deeply divided on issues ranging from abortion, marriage equality, racial inequities, and some have called on faith leaders to help heal this divide. From your experience as a pastor and a civil rights leader, your involvement with various nonprofit organizations, how would you advise us to heal these divides?
First of all,
yes. I forgot we were sharing.
that's quite all right. First, I think it's a wonderful opportunity to start right here because I think young people have an open-mindedness, so to speak, to say, hey, I'm open to dialogue. We've partnered with several churches throughout the city, but not only this city, but across the country and many other states, as well as other nations. We've traveled to see what is possible. And we've recently, one of the first outreaches that we partnered with one of the other churches was over Hope Be Free. We came together, we saw a dilapidated hotel that was in the community that we wanted to clean up. So instead of just looking at it, we said, well, let's do something. So we called meetings, and long story short, we developed probably about a $2 million development at that particular time, but it turned a dilapidated housing development into a place where people can come in an environment for their families. So it is possible. We meet on Tuesday mornings with other people of different ethnicities, if you will. And it's important to have open and honest dialogue. And sometimes we get on each other's nerve, but it's important to have that kind of conversation to talk about things that matter. I had, and I'm going to shorten it, I don't want to have to be my coattail pulled like the last speaker. I'm kidding. That was a joke. I have a sense of humor too, so got your attention anyway. At any rate, one of the last ones was when we had policemen come to our church. It's about 7 years ago. During service, I happened to be up. There was a gentleman that came. He was actually running from the police. He came inside because he was running, and the policemen came. Probably about 7 to 10 policemen came into service. And they interrupted the service. I was livid. I was up. I was mad. And one of the statements that I made was this. I said, if that had been on the west side of town, you would not have come in. You would not have just interrupted the service. And of course, man, did I ever get bombarded because so many different positions. I want you to know that we see things so differently, but we still have to come together to talk so we can at least share our perspectives or why we feel like we do. So that's how I think we can start that dialogue. So thank you all for being a part of that dialogue.
Thank you. Dr. Dooley, race bias, which is an often unconscious influence on the way we view things, can lead to stereotyping, prejudice, discrimination, and the way that politicians approach public policy in the domains of criminal justice, employment, education, and probably many other realms. Can you give us some examples of how race bias has influenced public policy recently or not so recently?
Well, I think one of the things that actually comes to mind when you say that, and there are a number of different studies, particularly when you look at K through 12 education, there's this notion of basically cultural expectation or cultural expectation bias, and it's a number of studies have looked at it, that when you have a teacher of a different ethnicity who are teaching students of a different ethnicity or race, that they will often have lowered expectations for those students. And the interesting thing about this is that those students will either rise or lower themselves to the expectations of the role model or teacher. So from that standpoint, that's a pretty straightforward sort of issue associated with bias. Now, if we can go on from by defining public policy as any action or inaction of government. What government chooses to do or government chooses not to do. And those are sort of a straightforward definition that I like to sort of utilize. Now, I'm probably going to step on Tess's toes a little bit when we talk about sort of the legalistic system from that standpoint. But I can say that when we think about the images and the imagery that they actually see, and when people don't interact with people of other backgrounds. And by the way, just so you know, I'm looking out on this crowd, and this is a very diverse crowd. And this notion of diversity incorporates everyone. It means everyone. So I'm looking out on this crowd, and it's a very, very diverse crowd. This is probably the highest level of diversity that you're going to have. It all goes downhill from here. So once you actually you leave this college environment, you leave this manicured park, you're going to go out into the quote-unquote real world, away from the ivory tower of academia, and then unfortunately we tend to go ahead and fall back on old notions of tribe. I would really implore you not to. Be a little uncomfortable. Reach out and make those connections and keep those connections with people that you actually have, because that's how you actually battle it. So the other issue I think about is it's late. I say all this. I go around the barn a little bit, and Tess has to kind of keep me back, thwarted. Go around the barn to get back to the point. The point I'm trying to make though is that when we think about law enforcement, there's a sort of bias because there's this view of the other. Well, this person is other. This person is different, and so maybe I'm a little anxious myself, and so when I'm on a traffic stop, I don't based on sort of my preconceived notions about what someone may or may not do, then things escalate pretty quickly. And oftentimes when we look at law enforcement, in a number of communities, law enforcement, they have poor training. We live in a nation with 89,000 different governments, and most of those governments do not have enough resources for training. So this notion of developing and building, your social capital, these social interactions that you're having right now are really, really critical to really combating some of these issues of implicit bias.
Thank you. Tess, in your presentation, you spoke about the many young black men and women that have been killed by police. I'm just wondering have any laws been passed to address that problem? Have any legal changes happened as a result? If not, could you recommend anything?
I guess I am on my soapbox, so I can. There has definitely been the Black Lives Matter movement has not just stopped at a hashtag, and it has. Thank you. It has morphed into some policy that's being proposed, and it's some action is coming out of it. We see some people coming out of the Black Lives Matter movement running for office. So I can't point to any laws specifically that has been passed to change things, but within communities there are things going on. We see one example under the former Attorney General Loretta Lynch under President Obama's administration. She began suing cities like Ferguson. So there was actually a lawsuit. There is a special provision in the law where cities can be held accountable when they have discriminatory, unconstitutional, discriminatory law enforcement procedures going on. And so what happened was that the city was sued. Typically there is a restructuring of the law enforcement. They try to make law enforcement more diverse. The training that you talked about is a huge piece of it. And so that is something we were starting to see happen. I mentioned the new Attorney General, Jeff Sessions, and he, it's difficult to think that is going to be a continuing thing that's going to happen like we saw under Loretta Lynch, just based upon some of the comments that he has made historically. But we do at the city, the good thing about, our government, in my Constitution class right now, many of you are in here from it, we talk about, the dual levels of government and talking about states, and we do see some states that are working on these issues. Illinois, we have a wonderful training program. One of my former students is actually heading training for police here in the state of Illinois, and is doing a great job in bringing, some of these issues of disparate treatment, police brutality, trying to train on the front end to head off these issues. There are several laws that should be passed, namely more training. I think it can start at the state level. Having diversity training is important. Having diversity brought into the system, not just I said it's not just police brutality that it ends there, but in the criminal justice system as well. Throughout, making sure that we have diverse judges. Black attorneys matter, right? So any of you who are interested in I'm going to put my hashtag interested in law, we need this. So definitely get involved. That will help.
Thank you. Tiffani,
The school-to-prison pipeline is a term used to describe what, the way students of color are disproportionately disciplined and even arrested in our schools, which sets off a chain reaction. Conditions lead to inconducive to learning, chronic truancy, eventual criminal behavior. So what do you see as the main reasons for this trend, and what can parents, teachers, and school administrators do to reverse it?
Ooh, that's loaded. Maybe a loaded question.
Or if you disagree that it even exists, then...
I don't disagree that it exists. That would be absurd to disagree that it exists. Because there have been a lot of really good documentaries that show that it does exist, and a history of social research that shows that it does exist. What's interesting, and to be fair, I'm not a sociologist who studies education, so I'm not really speaking from, I'm speaking a little bit outside of my realm of expertise, but what is interesting is some of the policies and such that are put in place in the school systems that sort of help to facilitate this pipeline. And so it's difficult to say what parents themselves can do other than the things that we always tell parents to do, which is to make sure that you're involved in what's happening in the schools, to make sure you know who's on your school board and what types of things that they are voting for, to make sure you know who the teachers are, to make sure that you know who the sort of politicians are who are allocating those funds to your school systems, those sorts of things. From a school perspective, it's actually even harder because so much of policy from the local level school comes from the federal level as well. And so you end up in a situation where, on the one hand, it's why we love these United States of America, is that we end up with autonomous states, but we also have autonomous states that are constrained by federal laws, rules, and regulations. And so it becomes really difficult in that regard. I think we have to change the way we deal with discipline, though, in schools. Might be one place to start, because a lot of the times disciplining children as if they are criminals sets into place this sort of perpetual thing that we see happening in the school-to-prison pipeline. It also leads to, obviously, the prison industrial complex and all these other highly loaded terms that we use today. So that's probably a good place to start from a school perspective, is changing our discipline structure, I think, will help in that regard. I'm not sure I fully answered your question. It's loaded.
Okay, and finally, Dr. Brand, you already started to address, I guess, the question that I was going to ask you. It has to do with sort of what are the, we know that these racial health disparities exist, and we know that there's a whole host of different factors in our lives that lead to them, and I guess you started to go into that, some of the hesitancy to trust the medical establishment and that sort of thing. But can you maybe just summarize, I guess, what you think are the most important reasons for the health disparities, and what can all of us do to try to reduce them?
Okay, sure. Well, I guess now you appreciate my lengthy talk then earlier. Well, one thing that comes to mind is cultural competency. Many times when individuals go to their healthcare provider, they have an appreciation of seeing someone that is accustomed to their culture, to their way of living, to their beliefs and values. If you are going to a healthcare provider that is diagnosing a certain ailment, and they're giving you a prescription of what to do, but that's outside of your parameters of your lifestyle or your culture, then it is quite challenging to abide by those recommendations. For instance, if I went to see a medical provider, a doctor, and the doctor told me to possibly go running in your neighborhood it will help decrease cardiovascular disease. Now, when he or she tells me that, mainly it'll probably be a he, because there's a need for more diversity in healthcare as well. He may not understand that there historically have been rules and regulations to segment populations. So I might not have been able to live in this area, in this neighborhood, but this neighborhood has parks there, has lighting, has trails, Bloomberg trails I can walk down and free of any violence. But if I'm only allowed to live in this certain area, there is poor lighting there. It's infested with crime because you have people that are low socioeconomic status that have been historically mandated to live in certain areas and not have been given the opportunity to live in other areas, or have been denied loans. Such as mortgage loans, to live in other areas, because that also impacts your health. So if he tells me to go walk out outside for exercise, but I'm living in this area that's segregated, like Chicago is one of the most segregated cities in the U.S. still, because I would like to walk, but there's violence, poor lighting, I'm afraid for my life, so maybe I may not walk, which may contribute to also higher incidence of disease. And in turn, I'm saying, well, why should I go back to that doctor? He doesn't really know what I'm experiencing. I've told them, but they kind of write off because they cannot empathize with what I'm experiencing. So cultural competency is a major aspect of increasing access to care as well. Access to care, as I mentioned before, is another major thing, but I elaborated on that earlier. Access to care, people may not want to go see someone who is not accustomed or who cannot talk the same language as you.
Thank you. Okay, we are going to open up to questions from the audience. Please raise your hand if you have a question, and you may direct it at a particular person or just in general. Okay.
Okay, my question is...
Wait 1 second, I have to get you a mic. It's being recorded, so wait for the microphone before you ask a question.
Okay, my question is, you guys showed that...
It's on.
Okay, my question is, at the beginning of the panel, you guys showed a video that had, I don't remember how many people were shot by police, and some people justified those actions of the police. Well, first of all, I feel like regardless if those people were committing crimes or not, they should have been thrown in jail if that was the case, instead of being shot or killed by police. And the question I have for you guys is, what is the message you have for the people who are justifying the police actions for the crimes being committed?
Who you're addressing it to?
Anybody that wants to answer.
Well, I'll take that. So the personal message I have, I kind of said it already, that, there's no reason that our sons should fear for their lives and not be able to walk down the street or sell CDs or, just be doing nothing at all, standing in a doorway like Amadou Diallo and be shot. That's not right. And so, sometimes we will hear the arguments that, there's something wrong, systematically wrong in the community that, I've heard the saying, well, we need more respect taught, so that, when they're approached by police officers, they know how to behave, but that's not fair, right? Because you're wanting to say something, I'll turn to it. But the point is that whatever your race is, right, you should have the same treatment from the police. So that's not correct. And we definitely see by the numbers, and I have several of the numbers here, that it is the case that there is this, especially for black men between the ages of 18 and 34, when we look at mortality data coupled with the rates of police, law enforcement, and death, it's 1 in every 65 deaths for African American men between the ages of 18 and 34 is due to the actions of law enforcement. That is wrong, and something needs to be done. So I would say that is wrong, definitely, and I will let you.
I just quickly want to say that, I always think about Flint of Castile, who was in his vehicle, who had been stopped 62 times, who was obeying and following all the commands that the officer was saying, and he still was assassinated. So for me, that really stands out. I got to tell you, something can be legal, but it can still be wrong, right? Laws, just because they're laws, don't mean that there's a moral component to the law. Slavery was a law of the land for a while. Sexism was a law of the land for a while as it relates in terms of how women were treated. We could go all the way down the list in terms of, for the most part, almost everyone in this auditorium would have been subject to something negative at some point in our history. So these laws can be changed and it can be made to be more moral, but it has to happen through placing that demand on power. It has to happen based on you saying, no, not today, no more. And I don't mean this in a violent way, but I mean this in a peaceful protest. I mean this in an organization standpoint. I mean this in forming coalition building kind of thing. I mean this in putting together, I may only have a quarter in my pocket, but 10,000 quarters can actually go a long way. So forming those types of coalitions. And so that's the only thing that power actually respects is other power coalitions. So that's one part I wanted to go ahead and put in there.
Thank you. Another question?
My question is addressed towards the doctor in the public health department. So basically, it's revolving around like minorities and obesity. When you read about like minorities and obesity, you see a lot about, I guess, the disparities of obviously the minorities, but they always mention like food deserts and talk about the lack of, I guess, like grocery departments where they sell like healthy food in those low income areas. But yeah, they don't talk about, and then they say they recommend, they talk about the recommendations of daily exercise of young adults and women, but I feel like they miss the environmental factors, like they miss that a lot, and I don't really see scholars talking about the environmental factors of those low-income areas, but yet they do suggest the physical activity, and then like questions arise of saying like whose responsibility is it? Is it the person's responsibility or is it the government's responsibility? So I just want to know your thoughts on that.
The key word that comes to mind is diversity on those type of committees that make those decisions at a community level. It starts at an educational level, like you all going to college, you're here for college, we all went to college to matriculate to those levels to be able to sit on those boards, to be able to make decisions at that level. Many times you have people who are on the federal levels, state levels that may not consider communities' perspective when they're making decisions like that. That's why there is a need for diversified researchers to be able to conduct community-based participatory research where community's perspective is involved in making changes. The ear of those researchers are available to hear what type of change can be made. What are the real true concerns at the ground level up? Because many times decisions are made from top down instead of ground up. But if there is a possibility for more people to engage in public health is one of the major fields that needs much diversity. But we all are here and we can contribute in some form or another by calling our legislators, making your voice heard, saying, hey, listen, this is in my community. We need something else. We all can take part in this, but there is a definite need for diversity, but we can all have an impact in that as it relates to food deserts and other things like that.
Thank you. Sure. Pastor Doss, he's asking for your response as well.
First of all, I take it very seriously. I'm an avid health person. In fact, I ran the marathon as young as I am, not that many years ago. So my point is, I think it's both. We have to take some responsibility. I'm big on self-responsibility. Yeah, the government has a part to play, but I think we should recognize that if they're telling us something and we do the research and it doesn't add up, we have a responsibility to make the right decision. So I think it's twofold. Also, I'm very connected with many of the, legislators, both in Chicago and in Springfield. So we have those conversations sometimes behind the scene, and when we're in those positions, we try our best to advocate for those that don't have the access to those that are making those decisions. But yes, it's very important on both sides. We have a responsibility as well as our government. And that was a great question too, son.
Thank you. Can we get somebody maybe on that side over there?
Just talking to us. Hi. I'm an older student and I'm a returning student. What I wanted to talk about is Springfield. I lived in an area where not just black, but white. If you were poor, you were being harassed in a certain area. They have this thing where if you don't stop 100 feet from the stop sign, don't ask me how I know that. If you don't stop 100 feet from the stop sign, you'll get pulled over. It's after a certain time of night. I worked with the homeless in Springfield for a long time, so I didn't get off until midnight. So coming home, oftentimes, as soon as I hit a certain area, I'm going to be followed. The thing about me is that I'll call the police on the police. I'm from the suburbs originally. We weren't treated that way. So I know that I could feel the difference. And what my point in saying this is that not everybody is going to be like me. Not everybody is going to know the difference. They're going to think that this is the norm. And then they don't do anything. And that's what's happening. For many, many people, this is their norm. And it was not my norm. And I will fight you. And that's all I want to say.
Thank you.
I had a question for Pastor Doss. My question was, what do you say to the churches that feel as if they don't want to speak about what's going on in the community? When Black Lives Matter happens, they grow silent to what's happening to the members, but also what's going on in the community. They feel as if the church doesn't have to have a presence in the community. So what do you say to those churches that feel as if they don't have to speak on it, or it's not regarding their members or what's going on?
Excellent question. I want you all to know that we have a tremendous responsibility as a church, as leaders. We have a responsibility from the standpoint that it affects all of us. And there's no way I can duck and dodge. Of course, there were those that sometimes, I guess they give me information and wisdom sometimes. They say, Pastor, you're going to be before people and they'll probably have cameras, so will you please kind of tone it down sometimes? But sometimes you have an opportunity. You want to speak your heart because it's not about playing it safe. It's about doing the right thing for the right reason, regardless of the cost. So I believe that those people that are hiding behind whoever, we need to step up, say this is on our heart, and let's talk. Yeah, it may cause some people to get mad at you. There were people that really got mad at me when I began to share, because a lot of people don't know what's in your heart until you say it. And when you say what's in your heart, they have an opportunity to disagree. But until you address it openly, you'll never make progress. It's too many phony people smiling at each other, but really they want to say, hey, I don't agree with that. I come against that. I don't believe like that. But I'm going to settle down. They told me to be quiet. So, but I think we have a responsibility to speak up. We're going to live once. Man, live it to the full, all right? Live it all the way. Live it all the way.
Well, they're recording, so I'm going to pass the mic.
First, I want to thank you guys for taking the time to come out today. My question is, what do you think causes the lack of differences for color and all of that in hiring? Do you think it has to do more with people that are doing the hiring, or do you think it has more to do with the fear of the rejection because of how they've been treated in the past? As far as law enforcement goes. No, anyone that wants to answer.
Well, I think as with hiring in general, coming from kind of being an attorney and working in HR areas, there is an overall issue with diversity in hiring that we can look at. And that comes in a couple of different ways from the people who are doing the hiring. And then also it comes from the hiring policies that are in place. And then it also comes from the lack of people who are applying for the positions, that are qualified for the positions. So it's on both sides of the table. We need more people who are going to be qualified for the positions and want to be engaged. And there was a huge call for African Americans to apply for the police force in Dallas, Texas, after the Black Lives Matter protest, when there was the shooting, and they were saying, let's diversify the force, and that's something. There needs to be more people who are interested in it, who are qualified for the position. But then, when we look corporate-wide in hiring, there are policies that need to be put in place where perhaps blind hiring. A lot of companies are now posting jobs on the internet and having a blind hiring policy that works well in bringing in diversity. I've had the benefit in being hired through that mechanism, and had an opportunity that I may not have had that not been put in place. So policies on the one hand, and then also people who want the positions and are more qualified on the other hand. So.
And I'm just going to add like one thing to that, is that just adding the bodies to the space doesn't matter if we don't also change the cultures of the space. So if we don't end up creating a culture that's welcoming for those diverse spaces or those diverse people, and also creating a culture where we can retain them, then it doesn't really matter. So this goes back to sort of the historical perspective, the fact that some of the reasons why people don't apply has to do with a history of exclusion. And even when they do apply, despite that history of exclusion, and they might get the job, that some of these sort of ingrained things that are part of our foundation continue to exist. So if we can't figure out how to deal with issues of race, we have a really hard time in this country talking about race. So if we cannot figure out how to deal with issues of race and talk about issues of race openly, we can't ever fix some of these problems, no matter how many policies we put into place. I mean, let's be honest, affirmative action was supposed to be one such policies that was not only supposed to deal with race, but also gender and all these other inequities. But if you don't change the culture of the environment, it doesn't really matter how many policies you put in place from the top.
All right, I just wanted to make sure it would work. I have a question. Anybody can address it. But first and foremost, thank you guys for being a part of this panel and sharing knowledge with the rest of the crowd. I guess my question would be, how do you think the Black Lives Matter movement will be written? What will be this final eulogy? I mean, we look at things give me a second. We look at things, years and years down the line and evaluate them. You had the Niagara movement, you had the NAACP, you had SNCC, you had CORE, you had the Black Panther Party, and all of them have their own sound bite. How do you think the Black Lives Matter movement will be written, what will be said about it, or what needs to be done so that it can have a perfect eulogy, so to speak, when that time comes?
Also a tough question. I think that their end remains to be written. So I think one of the things that has to happen, this has to happen with any group that's trying to organize people around the cause, is that one of the things that they get judged on is the result. So does your movement actually lead to systematic changes in society in some way? So I think that will be one way that on which they'll be judged that we haven't seen, if they're going to be able to do that as of yet. I think the other way that they'll be judged, though, and this is the way that I like to think about what's happening with Black Lives Matter, is that it's just a continuation of a long history of activism. It's just taking a completely different form. So whereas it was about and heavily focused on like marching and things like that during the 1960s and the civil rights movement, now we've seen people use a different type of technique and a different technology to sort of rally people around a particular cause. And so that's what I think it'll be written and talked about with regard to its mobilization using the internet and Twitter. Like, I really think that will be what we're discussing. Well, not us. We'll probably be dead, but like other people. Sorry. I'm just saying what other people will be discussing like many, many years from now is how like we were able to rally around this, use technology in a way that we hadn't been able to use before.
Hi, I want to thank everybody for all the great information so far. My question is directed at, I apologize, I don't remember your name, but the one with the legal experience on the panel, as well as Reverend Doss. So if you want to answer first, since you have the mic, that's fine. But my question is, I would like you guys' opinion on Blue Lives Matter legislation. We have a new piece of legislation here in Illinois, and if it's fairly new, so if you're not familiar with it, I can kind of tell you what it's about.
That would be great.
Okay, so it's a piece of legislation that a lawmaker has put forth that would make it a hate crime, anything that happens against what is being called a peace officer. So it covers police officers, corrections officers, EMTs, parole officers, anything that would fall into the category of police or peace officer. So it's battery, theft, property damage, trespass. It covers a wide range of things. Anything done to this, like if you break into an EMT's car, that would fall under a hate crime if this legislation passes. My question is, what are your thoughts on that? And especially considering we often don't hold responsible officers for things that they do wrong, and now we're extending hate crime not only from a class of people but a position, because normally it's always been African Americans or gays, a class of people, not just a job offer. So I just want you all's thoughts and opinions on that.
All right. Thank you for bringing that to my attention. I'm not familiar with that, but I think there's going to be several issues with that. So I'm not clear on exactly how it's going to be framed. The language. I know he's wanting to jump in, but he always does this to me. He won't let me speak. But that's not true. It's okay. But I think there could be definitely some constitutional issues there if they're trying to make a special class for them. I think that historically we can see that police officers, there's already when there is a crime against them, it has been treated as a hate crime. The penalties are usually pretty stiff. And there's not an issue with conviction, so that's a little bit a bit of a question for me is, is that really a necessity? I think it's definitely a hot button issue after we've seen things like in Dallas, what I mentioned earlier, where at the Black Lives Matter protests, there was the shooting directed at police officers. And certainly, I have family members who are police, and I am a huge, proponent of keeping our officers safe and letting them do their jobs. But I think that historically, if we look at how any crimes against them have been treated, it's dealt with pretty swiftly and harshly. They protect their own, certainly. So I will definitely look into that and see. I would like to follow that, because if they're trying to create a special class, that by occupation, that's not something that has historically been a protected class, so there could be some constitutional issues there. And I'll let Dr. Dooley give his 2 cents worth.
Notice she said she'll let Dr. Dooley. I'm married to an attorney, so there's no way that I run anything in the household. I just want to say this very it's interesting to me, though, in terms of when people ask for fair treatment. Black Lives Matter is only asking for justice, fair treatment. To me, I think it's more of a smokescreen, right? So let's go ahead and introduce legislation about blue lives matter or all lives matter or whatever. I always like to sort of frame it like this, and you've probably already heard it. Some of you have, some of you haven't. But it's almost like we're all going to a restaurant. We're all going to a restaurant, and we're all being served, except for, let's say, this gentleman. This gentleman is not being served. He's not going to. He doesn't get his food. His food doesn't come out, and so he complains that he doesn't have his food. And then we say, well, everyone should get served. Well, yeah, of course everyone should get served, but he didn't get his food, right? That's the same thing when we're talking about Black Lives Matter. Of course all lives matter. Of course blue lives matter, right? But the issue, though, is that in the application of the law, in the implementation of the law, in issues of justice, Black lives are not mattering, right? And so that's really sort of the key. So I think it's crap. I think this notion of this legislation is crap, and it's a smokescreen. It's my opinion. I don't have tenure, but whatever.
Okay.
Oh, did you want to start off?
Okay. No, I didn't want to comment on that, but thank you so much. I appreciate that. The gentleman over here, the gentleman in the back, he spoke about how will this end up, just shortly, just quickly. He said, how will this movement end up? I pray that it doesn't end, but it continues. I also want you to know that it didn't begin with Black Lives Matter. When I think about my parents, I told you I'd bring that up, and their upbringings in the South and what they endured through Jim Crow law and through some of the things that they experienced, and in fact, I remember walking with my dad on the street in one of the southern states, and a white gentleman was coming this way, and my dad pushed me off the sidewalk as he stood. I said, Dad, well, why we got to get off the sidewalk? He said, just get off the sidewalk, son. And then later on, he was to tell me, hey, you matter. This is where we are right now, but we've got to make progress. He graduated. He was 6th grade education left to work, but he raised 9 kids. Man, I get excited when I think about it. He raised 9 kids, taught them to be responsible. So Black Lives Matter starts in the house. Starts in the home. We need to instill in our children that you're valuable, you're important, and you can accomplish great things. I think it'll start there and will continue, so it shouldn't stop. It shouldn't stop. It should continue. So thank you again for your question. I'm done.
Hello. This question is directed to anybody that can answer. I know earlier we were talking about holding police accountable for their actions, and I had this discussion once before when we had the police panel up here, and I had the pleasure of talking to Chief Winslow. He's the Chief of Police for Springfield, and I told him, I feel like a good way to hold police accountable is to kind of change police culture. So right now police culture is like a thing. If an officer does something wrong, no matter if another officer thought that the officer was wrong, they stand by their officer. They stand by their partner's side, and they say, well, yeah, they just agree with it, or they'll like brush it off and just don't acknowledge the wrongdoing. So my question was, Morris, I'm sorry because I heard them say a couple of times, but the woman with the legal experience, I'm sorry, Dooley. I'm sorry, I was sitting down, so I couldn't see, so I couldn't actually see.
It's okay.
But more so, the question is more so for you, but anybody else that can answer. Exactly how challenging would it be to start that process to change police culture, to tell officers it's okay when one of your fellow officers do something wrong, you can speak out about it, because they, it's a fear of speaking out because they also get bullied within the department, So if we take that and we make the chief of police, you're going to be held accountable. If they can't say that somebody did something wrong without your officers bullying them or being punished for bullying them, then you should be held accountable, because they're going to continue to do things wrong until you punish them properly,
Yeah, it's a difficult question to answer, and I will say from experience of actually one of our best friends who came and spoke here last semester, I guess it was, a friend of mine who's now an attorney, former police officer, did just that and spoke out against racism that was going on within the Sherwood Police Department back in Arkansas, and was fired, lost his job, had been an officer for over 20 years. And so ended up suing the department, and let's just say his law school was paid for, and his went on to sue several different cities in Arkansas, and has won his cases for systematic racism by law enforcement. So it's very difficult for people within the ranks to speak out, and they do suffer consequences, unfortunately, when they do. So one of the things that we were seeing, I'll talk back about Loretta Lynch, the former Attorney General, the Department of Justice actually stepping in, and sometimes we have to see the federal government actually step in to make those changes and to stir up and get rid of some of the older officers who may actually be the problem within the system. So sometimes we will have to see outside forces come in, or see officers who are just willing to stand up, like our friend, do it, and may actually have to bring legal action for protection. And anyone else want to? Oh, okay.
You have the microphone?
I'm from a suburb that's like 45 minutes away from Chicago. It's called Waukegan. If you know, you know. There's a couple things about it, but where I'm from, it's like not that diverse. What I mean is mainly Hispanic people and a little bit of black people, a couple white people, and the only exposure I really had to white people was like teachers. And when I come here, I'm in the honors program, so it's mainly white people with like 10 black people thrown in and 1 Asian. And yeah, so it's like a different culture. And when I try to befriend people, they say like insensitive things, like I try to talk about Black Lives Matter and stuff like that, and it's kind of dismissed, or people make jokes out of it. I guess that's how they deal with it or whatever. But like sometimes they say like offensive and hurtful things. I'm talking about, I have like a couple of white friends. They say like insensitive things that actually like really hurts me. I'm like, I like question a whole bunch of things because they say it, and I don't know how to correct the behavior, because sometimes like if I correct it and come on too strong, they're like, oh, she's just bitter and black, like she's an angry black girl trying to like, and I don't want to come off like that, but I want them to know like what you're saying is hurtful, and you should be more open-minded towards these issues. So I don't, any of you have like a recommendation like what I should do, like how to correct these behaviors, because I can't go on through life being ignorant to like other people, like that's not right.
Well, I was thinking communication is a key. like Pastor Dawson mentioned, start a dialogue. Let them, if they're your friends, tell them how it makes you feel, that it makes you feel uncomfortable or upset, and how it has an impact on you. Because everyone outside of your own single race, or our own single race, is not our enemy. If you notice from the civil rights movement, you had blacks and whites that worked together to get change, to facilitate change. It wasn't just blacks. Even NAACP, which still exists today, is also have diversity also within the organization. So it's not just your own culture, your own people that try to facilitate, but there's strength in numbers. As he mentioned before, you have one quarter, but you have a lot of quarters put together. It makes a resounding sound if you drop it. Same thing. You have to understand that there are people that may not understand where you're coming from because you all have two different backgrounds or you think differently. Just even if you have a sister or a brother, you all may not think the same way. But if you communicate, it can kind of put out fires. If you're sharing a room with one another, somebody has some clothes on the floor or so, and it upsets you, but your sister may not know that. So tell them, hey, it upsets me. Can you please pick it up? Oh, I'm sorry, I didn't know. That problem is resolved. Sometimes conversations not that easy to have, but to have an effort to put forth to start that conversation. So communication is a major thing.
This university to help our students have that conversation, to within our classes, to bring those topics up so that they have the language, that they have the safe space to have those conversations, because it's not an easy, as you just said, it's not an easy conversation to have. And when you have had no interaction with difference, you live in most Americans in our society, live in segregated societies or communities and neighborhoods. We need, as a university, to have those forums and those spaces that we can have those conversations so that we can teach people how to communicate, because that's lacking as well. So it's our responsibility as well at this university. This is a good start, but faculty and staff need to also be having these conversations and again support students in preparing them for a diverse society and a global society, because we're failing at that right now.
Hello, thank you for coming today. So Black Lives and Police, we know that communication is important. When, hands up, don't shoot, they freeze position, but we look scared as victims, and handcuffs laid out on the ground. And before any action, it's always shoot. So my question is, have we lost communication between Black people and police? I feel like, personally, we have lost that communication relationship in a way, because now every time it seems someone is in trouble and the police show the first interaction is to run in fear of being killed. This is a general question, so anybody can answer.
I just want to just say briefly, and anyone can answer this question up here, but I think history does matter. We'd like to go ahead and discount history and just say we live in the moment, we live in the now. But the history of law enforcement in the African American community is a long one and a checkered one. Oftentimes, before the civil rights movement and even now, in certain areas, law enforcement wasn't really viewed as someone you could call that would come and help you. Law enforcement oftentimes were those that helped instigate, that would go ahead and allow the lynch mob to go ahead and come in. Law enforcement did not enforce the law in a number of communities of color in this country. So with that in mind, and I don't want to, you never want to make things personal because then people can't have a conversation. But I will say growing up, in my household, the police were viewed as the other. They were viewed as the enemy. They were viewed as if police are and I grew up in a in a 3-room shack in the Arkansas Delta with nothing except a little love and a little God. And I got to tell you that when police came through, we were told to move out of the way and leave, hide, don't engage. And so from that standpoint, in a lot of areas, in a lot of communities, we're just now sort of building a relationship with law enforcement, right? And law enforcement has a lot really, and I don't want to, I never want to assign blame because we're all in this together, but I will say though that law enforcement has to be accountable for the history that it has impacting communities of color. We didn't get here in a vacuum. And Trayvon Martin wasn't the first African-American man who was assassinated. This has been happening since the founding of our nation. And this is a really critical component to me because, I have a 14-month-old son. And, that could have been my son. So I have a huge issue and a huge responsibility that I feel to each and every one of you. And we've got to do better. So I'm sorry, I had to put that in there.
Yeah, I had a question kind of over here, kind of dealing with media and I guess what role you think that they play in it, because it kind of seems like the media likes to focus on the hot story because if a white person kills a white person, it's like, well, whatever. Same thing with like any other race, but it's really more of a hot topic if a white officer kills a black man and vice versa. So it kind of seems like the media blows it out of proportion. Not that any death is not insignificant, but I just kind of wondered about that. And then like if you have any advice of where you should look for like true facts, because it seems like the only place we have to look is the internet or what we see on the news, and that's exactly where all of these lies come out. And I guess it kind of hits home more for me because my dad's a master sergeant with the Illinois State Police and he oversees media relations. So I've personally seen where like he's up at 2 a.m. writing a news report that needs to be released, and like he like works so diligently to make sure that it's like, I don't know, properly said, and like then sometimes it gets twisted and it's like, well, I mean, what do you do? Because I don't know, sometimes it's just the wrong story or they twist it to where it's the most popular way to say it, and then everybody sees it and becomes outraged, and then it's like, I don't know, it doesn't seem like there's a way to correct that. So that's really to anybody, if you have anything to say about that.
Well, I'll talk about it more broadly. So in sociology, we have this notion that the media creates a culture of fear. And part of the way that they do that is by helping to shape the things that we should be focusing on. But what essentially they argue is that the things that we're focusing on are not actually, they're things that really impact primarily a small number of people, or they impact people in specific ways. And that partially why that happens is that it prevents us from focusing on things that require like large changes to society itself, because those things are much harder to accomplish. So it's much easier for us to focus on small things to make us fearful of smaller things than it is to focus on those things that require systematic change to society itself. Now, how you fix that is not by silencing the media. We just have to figure out some sort of other way to work with the media, however that happens. But and what's nice is there are people who are concerned about these sorts of issues and are designing programs and things like that that allow you to take a a news headline that you see or read or hear about, put it into a program, and then it traces sort of the history of that story for you so that you're able to track how true or untrue, where it starts to be spun in particular ways. So there are lots of people working on helping us to disseminate or to go through this information a little bit better. I don't know that fully answers your question, but the media is a complicated thing. They have, obviously, they're trying to get ratings and keep their viewership up and do all these other things while also sort of driving what it is that we focus on as a society and as a culture.
Oh, okay. My question is to the professor of African American Studies, and my question is, the rate of African Americans being killed hasn't really lowered over the years. They've just become more creative in the ways they kill African Americans, as in lynching and burning, going to murder by police. Right. So I was wondering, do you think in the future that killing will decrease, or killing will just stay like higher in the African American culture, just in a new way of killing?
If we take history as a guide, it'll just change. The form will change, is essentially what I'm arguing. But that doesn't mean that we should be pessimistic and not try to do something about it, which is really what this talk is about and what this panel is about. It's about bringing these issues to the forefront, talking about them in an open dialogue, because that's the only way that we can do something about that. But I think it's important, and that's why I wanted to talk about this sort of historical perspective and understanding that what's happening today is not unique to today, but is reflective of a long history, a history that we haven't adequately dealt with. And as a result, it's going to continue as long as we continue to ignore the fact that it's here and that we need to do something about it. So.
I just want to thank everybody for coming, and I just want to kind of close very, very briefly. I know we're running a little late here, but I just want to say that you have an opportunity. I want to close with I guess it's Donald Kennedy, who was the former president of Stanford University. He used to close every graduation with a poem, and I always want to. It's very, very, very quickly. Your days will be short here. This is the last of your springs. In the quiet and serenity of this lovely place, we live in a manicured park, really, feel the hymn of heaven, touch the depths of truth. You will go away with old and good friends, but before you leave, don't forget why you came. And you came here to learn. You came here to better yourself. You came here to make connections. You came here, hopefully, to go ahead and stand by your principles. I implore you to stand by them. I implore you to go ahead and think more of something beyond yourself. We live in think about community, think about God, think about family. It's important because we all are part of the broader human family. We all are individuals, and we all should have liberty and justice. That's right, liberty and justice for all. We pledge allegiance. We say it every day when we're going through K through 12, but somehow when we get our jobs, we forget, or something happens. And so our institutions need to reflect those ideals. And I will say, to end on a positive end, the total bent, I said it before, I got to say it one last time, the total bent of our history bends toward justice. We are a more just society today than we were in 1776. We are a more just society today. It oscillates, but it oscillates toward more and more and greater and better justice, but it doesn't get there by itself. It requires you to be active participants, for you to be engaged citizens, for you to be vigilant, or tyrants will go ahead and rule. Having said that, go forth and conquer, and thank you so much for coming.